Hello everybody, my name is Rachel and today I'm going to talk about 4 more of the Arthur C. Clarke Award winners that I've read recently. Unfortunately, I have to say up front that 3 of these 4 I was unimpressed by to varying degrees, so I'm going to talk about them in order from my least favorite to my most favorite, so we'll end on a high note with one of my favorite books I have read for this project so far. But let's start with the book that I actively disliked, and that was The Testament of Jessie Lamb by Jane Rogers. So this is set in the very near future when a virus has been let loose, all of humanity is infected with it, and it causes women to die when they become pregnant. This means that women can no longer bear children. They cannot carry them to term, so nobody's having babies. Women are dying left and right from accidental pregnancies. They're also being targeted, of course, misogyny. And our main character, Jessie Lamb, is coming of age in this time, and the real problem is that nobody takes the time to really talk about it with her. She, like many of her generation, like many of her peers and friends, feel rather scared. They don't have much of a future, the world is disintegrating around them, and they want to do something. So in a way, they're trying to be activists, and Jessie joins some groups and gets involved in some activism in her community, and then her father comes home one day and tells her that an experimental interim procedure has been developed that allows women to bear children to term. They call it the Sleeping Beauties program because women are put in a coma, they bear a child, and they will die. There's no getting around the woman dying, but they can manage to bring children to term so they survive. And her father says very glowing things about this, about how heroic these young women are, this making the ultimate sacrifice for their country, for their species, for humanity. And Jessie decides to volunteer for the Sleeping Beauties program. And this book is her trying to explain and justify this terrible decision. Now, I have to say that I'm not exactly sure what the age is that kids in the UK become adults. Here in the US, you're a minor until you turn 18, but I think it might be 16 in the UK. So my chief complaint of this may not be valid in the UK, which is that I felt like Jessie was a minor. She is a child, and there should be absolutely no legal way for her to make a decision like this. There's a reason why you're classified as a minor, because you are not emotionally, mentally mature enough to make decisions on this scale. You're too naive and innocent and ignorant. And that is what I was railing against through this entire book. It is a pretty typical bratty, naive teenager trying to justify her suicide. And that's really unpleasant. I get the point of the book, which is to talk about the terrible moral dilemmas that a situation like this, which is kind of a distilled war on women, what that situation creates. But it felt like the entire book was artificially contrived to get one vulnerable teen to make this decision and try to stick with it when everybody is saying no, including her parents, who should have the final say on this, you know. There is some language that Jessie uses when trying to justify this that basically sounds like she is suicidal. So in some ways, the book comes across as trying to justify like a socially acceptable way of committing suicide, of saying that your suicide is a sacrifice for the greater good, that you're doing the ultimate heroic thing. And that is bad. I don't like the way that that comes off. And I don't like the way that all of the adults in the story don't seem to get the point, which is you need to be a bit more involved in your child's life. And you can't be a hypocrite. Like, one of the few intelligent remarks that I think Jessie makes that really gets to a bit of the point of the book is that at one point her father is saying, why would you want to do this? I don't think you should do this. And she says, but you told me it was a good thing to do. But are you saying that it's only good for other people who aren't your daughter to do it? Like, don't you realize that all the women who've already volunteered for this are somebody else's daughter? You think this is okay up until somebody you love wants to do it, and there's something wrong with that thinking. You can't be hypocritical like that around your children. They will pick it up, and it could lead to disastrous consequences like this. So I didn't like it. I didn't like the ideas. I thought that as a dystopian, it was pretty run-of-the-mill. It's not well written. That's the point I'm trying to make here. This is not a good story. It is not a well-written book. The dialogue is so wooden that I was rolling my eyes. It just didn't work. If you want to talk about something like this, you have to do it with more subtlety, more skill, frankly. I think this very same story could have been told by somebody else and it would have worked. It wouldn't have made me have such a knee-jerk reaction to it because it could be written better. So this is not one that I would recommend. Maybe there's something in it for other people, but I think there are far better dystopian feminist type books out there that will not rankle as much as this one does, especially if you have children. I mean, I'm not a parent, but I can imagine that if you are a parent to children, to teenagers, this could be like your worst nightmare and it's not handled well, so just pass. Next up is 13 by Richard K. Morgan, and now we're going into mediocre but okay territory here. This book was not intended for me as the audience, so I don't want to be too hypercritical of it. It is basically a super soldier story. The title 13 refers to these men who have been genetically modified to have all of the super hyper alpha masculine traits that have been supposedly bred out of humanity because they're not necessary in the modern world, but they modify these men to turn them into super soldiers. Then the programs don't go well, they're decommissioned, and all the 13s are exiled to Mars. The main character, Carl Marsalis, is a 13, and he actually made it back to Earth legally by winning a lottery, and he is hired as a bounty hunter to track down other 13s on Earth and send them back to Mars. In the beginning of the book, 13 makes it back from Mars, lands on Earth, and then goes on a serial killer spree, and Carl teams up with this woman who's an ex-NYPD cop, I think, to track down this guy and stop him and figure out how he even made it back to Earth, who is helping him. It seems like a really deep conspiracy. And that's pretty much the story. And the entire book was rather tediously long. This is supposed to be like a noir thriller, and I could feel that right up until scenes started repeating themselves. There are some interesting conversations about what it means to be human, like are you still human when you've been modified so much? And people didn't choose to be made into 13s, basically, so what's the responsibility here? If you didn't make the choice, what does that make you? But a lot of those conversations happened ad nauseum, and it was just getting boring by the end. And part of the endless scenes grating on my nerves is that it felt like it was wringing every little bit of emotion out of the story instead of leaving you on an emotional high. I actually think the story is pretty devoid of emotion anyway, especially because it feels like a lot of the characters end up falling into stereotypes, doing exactly what you would expect them to do in a cliche story. And part of that I don't like is that the primary female character, of course, falls for Carl in a very lust-driven way. And this is supposed to be because 13s being alpha males are supposed to be like viscerally, primally attractive to women. So Carl ends up sleeping with a bunch of ladies who basically meet him and say, oh, I totally want to go to bed with you. But that just feels very perfunctory. When your sex scenes are perfunctory and your characters stop feeling like people and feel more like puppets acting out a script that you've made for them, that is not good. So At parts of this, I enjoyed the story because, hey, you're hunting down a serial killer and it's basically a detective story. I enjoy those, but then I would be bored out of my mind for long stretches. The best thing I can say about this probably is that I listened to it on audiobook, and the narrator was Simon Vance, and he did a great job. Sometimes I don't like the way that male narrators do female voices, but he did a really good job with the women in the story, and I just felt like the only emotion coming through in the story was what the narrator was imbuing it with. So that helped a lot, and if you don't want to wade through the 600-page print book, then I would recommend the audiobook. The third book I want to talk about is Dreaming in Smoke by Tricia Sullivan. This one I was rather pleasantly surprised by in places, probably because I was expecting the worst. I happened to notice that a bunch of Sullivan's works had very low Goodreads ratings before I started reading this, and that colored my first impressions. However, I ended up really liking aspects of this book, and I enjoyed reading it. This book is about a human colony struggling to survive on an alien planet with very limited resources in a very volatile environment that they do not fully understand. Humans had sent a colony to this planet when they originally thought that it was hospitable, but when they arrive, the conditions are drastically changed from their initial probe results, and they do not understand what's going on, and they cannot breathe the atmosphere. And they're also stuck there, they can't go home. So the colonists establish their habitat, they raise a second generation, and they start to study this Luma substance on the surface of the planet, which they realize has many interesting properties. It can be kind of like water, it can be kind of like lava. It's not an organism, it is more like a system and ecology itself that has organisms within it that they can study the properties of. This is one of the coolest aspects of this book, and the whole bit about the world building and how this Luma substance worked and the research on it and trying to solve the problem of terraforming their atmosphere was really interesting to read about. Maybe not scientifically accurate, maybe a little bit techno-Babylonian sections, but interesting nevertheless. Now, this colony is only really maintained by an artificial intelligence that they call Ganesh. Because their environment changes so rapidly with these thermal storms in the Luma, their habitat has to be kept in balance by the AI. They can't do it manually. And they also rely on Ganesh for their data storage to store all the information they have from Earth and from living on this planet. And then at the beginning of the story, everything starts going wrong. The main character is Calypso, one of the younger generation who's probably in her 20s, and she's what they call a shotgun. They manage to interface with their artificial intelligence through kind of like virtual reality dream sequences, and a lot of their scientists go into this dream to kind of unlock the potential of their unconscious, subconscious minds and be very creative in their work. And Calypso's job is to facilitate the dreams for scientists. She rides shotgun with them, and she has a good working relationship with the AI. At the beginning of the story, the scientist that she is shotgunning for seems to go completely berserk and nuts in the dream, and then the AI starts to crash. Everybody blames Calypso for this. They think that she had brought something into the dream that contaminated Ganesh, but she thinks that the scientist did something. So their habitat is falling apart, they're losing all of their data and all of their systems, and all of these secrets of the colony start coming out. This would have been a really fantastic story if I hadn't been so irritated by the main character. The problem is that she is a complete lazy ass. She is actually infamous in the colony, as at least one person says, for having cultivated no useful skills. And there are repeated scenes in the book where she is helpless, unable to help herself or other people to even really comprehend what's going on because she never paid attention. It's not really fun to read about somebody who is so oblivious and helpless and willfully ignorant. I guess it worked. I mean, the story didn't stall because of this, but I just don't find reading about a person like that to be very fun. Once I get past the problem of the protagonist, I think the story was really interesting. I wish there had been fewer bizarre Fantasia-like dream sequences because they really added nothing. Most people in the story didn't understand them. Calypso didn't really understand them either. And at that point, they just became redundant wastes of space in the story. If you're gonna have dream sequences, they should be less impenetrable, in my opinion. And I'm not a fan of acid trippy stuff in books anyway. It's just not what I enjoy reading. So this one I think could be a real Marmite book. You might really enjoy it, you might really dislike it. I managed to fall in that confused zone where I noticed things that I really, really liked, but also noticed things that I found irritating. So this one, I think I've come around to saying I would recommend reading it if you're curious, but if you know that this type of character really gets on your nerves, I would skip it. And finally, a 5-star book, Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikosvky. I myself am very surprised that I like this book so much, given that half of it is about an arachnid civilization, and I really, really hate spiders. The perhaps saving grace of the story is that I read it as a book and I did not have to make myself look at spiders, and I didn't really have to visualize spider bodies that much. And it's the shape of spiders and the way that they move that really, really creeps me out. Their habits, not as much, but their bodies definitely, yeah. But I learned some interesting things about spiders in this book. I think it was pretty well researched from the arachnid and insect standpoint and presents a really interesting viewpoint of the world through a spider's eyes, through a spider's perception. Just truly alien. It's really interesting to read an alien story from the perspective of something that is so ordinary on our planet, but it's not human. So that was really cool. The premise of this book is really quite simple. A very advanced humanity spawns this project to use a nanovirus to speed up the evolution of monkeys. They basically want to put monkeys, a nanovirus, on a terraformed planet, seal it, quarantine it, and then come back some odd thousand years later to see what's happened. Unfortunately, humanity enters its death throes near the launch of this project, and the project is partially sabotaged. The nanovirus ends up on the planet, but the monkeys burn up in orbit, and instead the nanovirus goes to town on all of the little things that humans had disregarded, like spiders and ants and crustaceans. So humanity is mostly dead, the planet is left alone, spider civilization starts to grow, and then an ark of the remnants of humanity shows up a couple thousand years later and wants to colonize the planet. So you have the upward trajectory of one civilization, of one species, and the downward trajectory of another. And the fact that the arachnids are the accidental children of humanity, and humans are a little bit hardwired to fear and hate spiders. I thought this was fascinating. I didn't necessarily understand or believe in the plausibility of some of the genetics going on, especially the role that the nanovirus plays, but with a little bit of suspension of disbelief and just letting it go, I was able to really get into the evolutionary processes of the story. Because frankly, about half of this book is watching evolution happen. You get some snapshot stories with the spiders and then that eventual showdown between the makers and their creation, but it's a very, very long story arc, a very broad picture, and I really enjoyed that. The humanity side of it, well, let's just say that all of my favorite characters were spiders, and I really didn't see the saving grace of humanity at the end. And I was really surprised by the ending as well. So this one I really, really enjoyed. And I would say that even if you don't like spiders, this was not scary. in that way. And it was really interesting and challenging to be put into the viewpoint, the perspective of a spider. I am glad that I finally read a book for this project that I really, really liked. It's been a while since I have loved one of the Clarke Award winners. I've definitely liked the more recent ones better than some of the older ones, I think, but it might be too early to really say what my tendencies are. So if you have read any of these books and you want to talk to me about them, whether you might want to defend The Testament of Jessie Lamb or tell me how much you disliked Children of Time, either way, please let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching me once again, and I will talk to you again soon in my next video. And until then, bye.